We have great pleasure in having Professor Stefan Schuster of the University of Vienna giving a talk on his work on applying game theory in cell biology. So those of you who are still wondering, what use is game theory for, let's say, biology, despite the lectures on evolutionary game theory, will actually see an actual application. Um, so um, Stefan is, of course, no stranger to the institute. He has been to this institute several years back, and several of us have actually visited him at the University of Vienna. He has a wide variety of interest, including infectious diseases, evolutionary game theory, metabolic control, biochemical oscillations, and metabolic pathway analysis. He's also has been an extremely gracious host who's always willing, always like very welcoming to Indian students, postdocs, faculty members, and ask them to visit Vienna. So Stefan, we now invite, the stage is yours. Please, you know, inform us about
Yeah,
your work.
thank you very much for this kind introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and for the introduction. I want to speak about applying game theory in cell biology. My affiliation is Friedrich Schiller University in Vienna, and this was a German poet who really lived in Vienna for several years and then later moved to Weimar. And then I looked for a quote by Friedrich Schiller about playing or games, and is really one in the man here on the bottom. You can see the English version. Man only plays when he is in the fullest sense of the word a human being, and he's only human when he plays. I mean, for my talk, maybe it's not so important because we use the word game theory, but in principle, it's not a playing situation.
Stefan, is it
Yeah.
possible for you to put your mic closer to your yeah.
Yeah. So then
Yeah,
maybe it's not loud
I think
anymore.
there's some problem with the audio quality, and
Oh, okay. Yeah. Could be
is it
due to
better
my
now?
mic. Maybe I will speak slowly and loud.
Okay,
Can
sure,
you can you
sure.
hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So this is an interesting quote, but it's more about playing, whereas we apply game theory to serious situations and not so much about games or playing. So the application in biology. So I would like to start with Charles Darwin, and he came up with this concept of survival of the fittest. And fittest implies some optimization, because only the best or the second best will survive. And actually, the Darwinian theory was disseminated in Germany by Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was a German biologist, and he also worked in Jena. And this, I think one of the ideas in this theory is that there's a better and better adaptation to a fixed environment. No? They speak about adaptation, uh, but it's in fact more complicated because the environment is not fixed, is not constant, but is shaped by other organisms. Yeah? And therefore, evolution should, in most cases, be considered as a co-evolution. Yeah? The several species co-evolve. A nice example is flowers and pollinators. So they're complicated shapes in orchids, for example. And then there is no real optimum because the shape of the bee, is adapted to the flower, but the flower is adapted to the bee. Yeah? And therefore, there are, so to speak, infinitely many possibilities of such an adaptation. Yeah, and therefore the theory of optimization needs to be extended, and one way of extending is by game theory. The main founder of game theory was John von Neumann, who came from Hungary but then exiled to the United States, and he established that in the 1940s in Princeton. Actually, several game theorists worked in Princeton, and of course, John von Neumann is very well known also in other fields of mathematics. For example, he introduced cellular automata, or there are the von Neumann boundary conditions. Yeah, then another important person was John Maynard Smith, a British scientist. He worked also in Britain, and he was the founder of the concept of evolutionary stable strategy. which is in a sense, an extension. I will come to that later. And was one of the first who applied game theory in biology, because John von Neumann didn't apply it in biology. Yeah, the basic concepts in game theory are players which can adopt strategies. Strategies is a bit maybe an exaggerated word because it can be a very simple decision. Yeah? For example, driving a car, we can go on the left side or on the right side. I don't know whether this can be called a strategy, but in game theory it's called like that. So then, depending on the choice of one player and also of the other player, each player gets a payoff. You know, this word comes from economy, but in biology we usually call it fitness, or maybe some other reward, which is then obtained by a certain set of strategies. But importantly, it depends also of the decision by the other players. Yeah, and then equilibrium situations can be determined, and these are so-called Nash equilibria, or then in extension the evolutionary stable strategies. And Nash equilibrium is called after John Nash, actually, who also worked at Princeton. And yeah, this is briefly saying a situation in which neither player can increase payoff by changing strategy unilaterally. This is important, unilaterally. Also not in agreement with the others, so to speak, they are not allowed to make an agreement, so to speak, but only if changing unilaterally, the other one is constant. So, for example, two wolves, if they fight, two male wolves, for example, deciding about the pecking order, then usually at the end one of them surrenders and the other one is dominant. And then there is no incentive to change strategy unilaterally because the dominant wolf will certainly not change to surrendering. And the surrendering wolf will also not change to dominant because if both are dominant, then they could harm each other, which is then a lower payoff than for the surrendering wolf. And then what is sometimes not so explained in textbooks is how is the Nash equilibrium attained, how it is reached. And I think in most cases there are some iterations. Also here in this case, some fight or at least some ritual is necessary that they agree who is surrendering and who not. And a nice example is when two persons cross each other on a sidewalk. Then a little bit like in the traffic right-hand side or left-hand side, but there in the traffic now there are official rules. No? In India it's left-hand, in Germany it's right-hand side. But on the sidewalk it's not so clear. Although one could say in continental Europe we always go on the right side, but it's not so. No? It's, so to speak, decided each time. And then there are often some iterations. No, we go to the right, but maybe the other person goes also goes to the left from his side, or the right from our side. And so and then maybe they both change back, and then sometimes it can be an embarrassing situation. But after some time, then we agree on a Nash equilibrium. And here in this case, we have two Nash equilibria, namely both to the right or both to the left. And this actually the so-called coordination game is one of the game types. Or another situation when we enter a room, who goes first to the room or to the underground coach, and then actually communication is important. Here the communication is just by looking at the other one, and here one could even speak with each other. After you, please. So there are also some iterations, but it's not in all games. No? There are some games where there is no information exchange. No? For example, if my mobile phone is broken and I cannot communicate with another person, or other situations, and then often the Nash equilibrium changes. Yeah, there was also some criticism of the concept of Nash equilibrium because it ignores psychological and moral factors. No? For example, trust. Yeah, for example, in the prisoner's dilemma, game theorists assume that everyone is acting selfishly and does not trust the other one, but often in society there is trust, or also other psychological factors like spite, for example. And I think that concept of measure often does not apply in sociological context or even for higher organisms, but in microbiology and cell biology, it's very well appropriate, because microorganisms, they cannot trust each other, so to speak. They have no psychological factors. And yeah, then another criticism is that in some games, for example, the ultimatum game, there are too many mesh equilibria, and then it's not clear which one is relevant, and therefore several alternative solution concepts were introduced. For example, by Aumann, the so-called correlated equilibrium. For example, if the mobile phone is broken, as we have no communication, and then, for example, husband and wife want to go out, but they don't know should they go to the opera or to the football game. Then they could, for example, beforehand make an agreement on an even day in the month, they go to the opera, and on an odd day, they go to the football. This would be then a correlation. There's also Kantian equilibrium, and then actually related to the Kantian equilibrium, the so-called co-action equilibrium, and this was introduced by two persons which are in the audience. I'm happy to see them again, although it's only online. So yeah, this was really established in Chennai, and yeah, we discussed it several times. And then for the ultimatum game, Ramzi Suleiman in Israel, he came up with the idea that the golden ratio could be also important in game theory. And actually, independent of him, I also came up, but I published it. 2014 was a preprint, and then later he published it in a journal, and I published it in a journal in 2017. But here, this talk, I will use the concept of mesh equilibrium. This was just to show that there are also other concepts. So the first biological, also example from cell biology, is so-called sequential cross-feeding. This means that two bacteria degrade glucose to carbon dioxide and water to produce energy, or ATP, and they have to degrade glucose, which is the one of the sugar molecule. And there are two strategies, so to speak, two possibilities, namely either to degrade glucose to acetate, which is in vinegar, or ethanol. For example, Escherichia coli is a bacterium who can produce acetate. Baker's yeast makes ethanol, as we know, because it's used in beer and wine. So or degrading acetate further down to carbon dioxide and water. And glucose is the preferred substrate. So both of them compete for glucose, but they cannot make the first pathway, and both of them cannot go the first pathway, because then the acetate would not be degraded. And acetate in higher concentrations is toxic because it's very sour, very acidic. So there's a negative feedback. And therefore, one of them finally has to surrender, so to speak, and say, okay, I'm happy with acetate. And this is then the so-called follower bacterium. It's a little bit like the hawk-dove game, but so did I mention hawk-dove? Also the game between the two wolves, so that one of them surrenders and the other is dominant. But here it's a little bit different, because if we now look at the so-called payoff matrix, this is also a concept in game theory that we, especially in two-player, two-strategy games, we write this as a matrix, and then we have these payoffs. Also, player A obtains, for example, 1 unit. Let's say the fitness is 1, but we can normalize it. This is also important property. It can be normalized or scale. Because, for example, multiply all payoffs by 10, and then it will be the same game. So let's say the best is taking glucose if the other one takes acetate. Therefore, 3/2 is the best outcome for A. And in each field or each box of the matrix, there are two numbers, payoff for player A, and in red, the payoff for player B. So 2 is also good, but 3 is even better. So then, of course, it's symmetric the other way around here on the lower left. So then let's say if both use glucose, they can survive somehow, but it's not very good. So let's say 1/1. But both acetate is impossible because if no one is producing acetate, they cannot use acetate, so therefore it's 0, 0. And yeah, and actually, if we now analyze the order relations among the payoffs, it's not a walk-up game, it's so-called Battle of the Sexes game, sometimes called Leader 3. I will show you later the classification of the games. And yeah, and Battle of the Sexes is related to what I told before, namely if husband and wife want to go either to the opera or to the football, each of them has a preferred. Let's say the husband prefers football, maybe it's a cliche, but and the wife prefers opera, and then it is like here, no preferred substrate, non-preferred, no preferred activity, non-preferred activity, and then it's a similar payoff matrix. So then, yeah, the next biological application is a description of the competition between cancer cells. And this is based on a very interesting paper I can recommend by Basanta, Hatzikiro, and Deutsch. Is Andreas Deutsch in Dresden in Germany, and in 2008. So they considered two tumor cells, or it could also be actually two aggregates of tumor cells, and they compete and they can switch between two different types, namely, so to speak, the sessile type, also which stays resident and is proliferative. So they can proliferate, has high cell division, and or a motile type, which goes away and actually forms a metastasis, in medical terms. And so then they assume that B is the availability of nutrients, for example, glucose, and C is the cost for motility. Maybe they have to express some proteins to go away and to attach to a so-called second, there's a primary site and a secondary site. So, and then maybe this is an oversimplification, but they assumed if both cells are proliferative, they have to share the nutrients, so each of them gets B half. Then if one of them moves, the resident cell gets B, the total nutrient, and at the secondary side also B, but it has to pay the cost, therefore B minus C. And if both of them move, then they have to pay only half of the cost, because the total distance, so to speak, is then the same, and therefore then it proposes B minus C half. And yeah, and then we were intrigued by that and thought, oh, which game types can occur? Is it a prisoner's dilemma or whatever? And so this is just another representation because I want to show that this is a symmetric game, right? Like actually also in cross-feeding, because both players have the same set of strategies and the same possible payoffs. Later I will show also asymmetric games. And and then in a symmetric game, it's sufficient to write only one payoff in each box of the matrix. Let's say it's the payoff for player A. It's a bit harder to read, but it's maybe simpler. And so yeah, no, I show the transparency about the Hawk Duff game, also alternative names for it. And in the simplest form, there are two strategies, namely to be aggressive, also be dominant, like the wolf. This is called Hawk, and although it need not be the animal of Hawk. And the peaceful strategy is Duff. And yeah, this is often observed in nature. But actually, these two pictures don't show mesh equilibria because here both are dominant, and then they can harm each other. So the mesh equilibria are actually that one of them surrenders, and when it's symmetric, yeah, then it's interesting if there are two mesh equilibria, which of them is reached? And this is actually often depends on initial fluctuations. So like in bistability, it's a bistable situation. And so in the metastasis game, the Hawk-Duff game occurs if the cost is less than B half, which means high benefits. B is then larger than 2C, so the high benefit case. And in cancer biology, this is called the go or grow phenomenon. Also either grow, proliferate, or the go away. And yeah, this means metastasis occur. And yeah, then this is an important but maybe difficult point if we consider population, because here we just consider two cells, which is of course an oversimplification. but to some extent, one can apply or extend these results to populations. No? If you have maybe 100 cells or 100 vulvas, no? Then the population subdivides into two subpopulations. As if there are two mesh equilibria. If there's only one, then of course the entire population does the same. So then, if in the let me see, this is yeah. So in the low benefit case, if B is less than C, then we have the so-called deadlock one gain, which is much less known. And this can be explained by two streets. So actually, there is a similar game called root choice, which is the deadlock two game. And in both, also deadlock one and deadlock two, we can the cover story, so to speak, that there are two car drivers, then each can choose among a highway and a narrow road. The best case is driving on the highway alone, and the other one is on the narrow road, but the other one will not surrender, so to speak. So actually, I didn't mention it here, but the mesh equilibrium is that both use the highway, because sharing the highway is still better than the narrow road alone. And similarly, both here, this is the mesh equilibrium, both cells stay and are proliferative. Although each cell would be better off if the other one goes to the other road or goes away, but the other one will not do it, because it wants to have the higher payoff. As a mobile tumor cell would provide a high advantage to the other cell, which could then stay. The difference between root choice and deadlock gain is that the root choice, the narrow road alone, is better than sharing it, whereas in the deadlock gain, sharing it is the narrow road is better. For example, we could say that they can help each other in case of an accident. But for the mesh equilibrium, this does not matter. And then there is a third gain type, namely in the intermediate benefit case. If B is less than 2C but larger than C, then we have the prisoner's dilemma, which is very well known. And this is, of course, a paradoxical situation because both cells, it would be better for both cells to go, but finally they stay, because there is a temptation to stay. If one of them starts going, then the other one will be happy and stay because it has the higher payoff. But then the other one thinks, oh no, then I also stay because it's still better than to go away. Together with Charlie Trivedi, who is from India, PhD student in my group, who is also present online, we generalized or extended this model because we thought it's a bit artificial to say, for example, that the benefit is the same on the primary and secondary side, and then both go away, then the cost is exactly half. And therefore, we came up with 5 modifications of the game. And for example, here, modification 1 is that the benefit at the secondary side is described by parameter A, which is not necessarily the same as B. But then, of course, the number of gain types increases because now it depends on several order relations between A, B, and C. And this can be nicely illustrated here on this diagram, the benefit cost plane. On the left-hand side, there is the Basanta-Hatzikiro-Deutsch model. Then we have these 3 cases, high benefit, intermediate benefit, and low benefit case. And in this modification, there are 6 different cases. So on this deadlock gain, actually, I forgot to mention whether it's deadlock 1 or deadlock 2. Then prisoner's dilemma, stack hunt gain is another one, but I don't have the time to explain these game types. Hot death game, I explained. And then harmony 1 and harmony 2. But harmony, I will explain briefly. There we have only one mesh equilibrium in which both players adopt the cooperative strategy. So this is, as the name suggests, everything is in harmony. So probably for a theater play, like Friedrich Schiller's plays, it's not very appropriate because there's no conflict. And a nice example are penguins in the cold, and they form groups. And there is no incentive to leave the group because then this individual would freeze, so to speak. So then everyone cooperates and is in harmony. And the difference between harmony 1 and 2 is again some order relation among not the strategies which are not so good anyway, so that does not affect the Nash equilibrium. Yeah, and in symmetric two-player, two-strategy games, yeah, I explained this already, and then we can write the payoff matrix in this simple way with just four parameters. And in principle, or in fact, we can reduce the number of parameters to 2 because I told you we can scale all of them and we can also shift them by an additive term. Yeah, this also does not change the order relations. And therefore, practically only 2 degrees of freedom. And now the different game types are distinguished by different order relations. Yeah? For example, in the prisoner's dilemma, we have S is less than P is less than R is less than T. T is the temptation, so it's the highest payoff, the temptation to cheat, so to speak. Yeah, and then there is this nice classification of game types, namely there are 12 different game types, prisoner's dilemma, hot bath, I mentioned already several of them. Battle of the Sexes is also in this cross-feeding game, harmony, stack hunt game, coordination game I mentioned, right-hand side or left-hand side traffic. And and this can be plotted in the ST plane, because then these are the 2 degrees of freedom. And finally, for all modifications, we came up with for the metastasis game, we plotted all possible game types in this ST plane. So you see there are several game types, not all, for example, coordination game does not occur, and also some are exactly on the boundary. For example, here 2 and 3 are on the boundary between root choice and deadlock. To explain even more the difference between symmetric and asymmetric games. So the first point I have explained already. There is an important result in game theory, namely that in symmetric 2-player, 2-strategy games, always at least one pure Nash equilibrium exists. A pure means that the player decides just for this strategy and does not change. So there's no probability between 2 strategies involved, but just one decision. I mean, there can be 2 Nash equilibria, but finally both players agree upon one of them. Whereas in symmetric 2-player 3-strategy games, there is not always a pure Nash equilibrium. And the famous example is the rock, scissors, paper game. You know it. Rock, scissors, paper, and then they cannot agree on a Nash equilibrium because on a pure one, because if, for example, I always play rock, the other player will always play paper, and he will win. And therefore, one should change strategies and do it stochastically with a certain probability, and this is then called mixed Nash equilibrium with certain probabilities. And interestingly, the same can occur in 2-player, 2-strategy games if they are asymmetric. For example, let's consider penalty shooting in soccer. Then usually the offensive player has 2 strategies, playing to the right and to the left. In principle, you could also play in the middle, but I have read that psychologically it's not so good. Psychologically for the viewers, for the audience, so to speak, because then they say, this is boring to play in the middle. So therefore, sometimes they do, but usually they play either to the right or to the left. So on the goalkeeper also has 2 strategies, jumping to the right or to the left. And now they have conflicting interests. There is no pure Nash equilibrium because if the offensive player always shoots to the right and the goalkeeper always jumps to the left on his side, then the goalkeeper will win, and therefore the offensive player will change to the left. But then if the goalkeeper reacts, and it's again switching back and forth. And Yeah, and in game theory, this is called a matching pennies game. The cover story is that two boys have a penny each and hide it in their hand and then open it. And if both are tails up or head up, then one boy wins. And if they are different, then the other boy wins. No? And there's also no pure Nash equilibrium. Yeah, now I come to the next biological application, namely host pathogen interactions. Yeah, yeah, I was told that I work also in our group, we work on infection biology or infectious diseases. For example, here in Jena, in one institute, there is a strong focus on pathogenic fungi. Also not so much bacteria, but fungi. It's, it's a special trademark of the research in Jena. For example, Candida albicans. And yeah, in 2015, we published a review about these host pathogen interactions and yeah, how to understand and model the defense and evasion strategies because um, the human host has some defense strategies to defend against these pathogens, but the pathogens have evasion strategies, which could also be called counter defense. So to try to inhibit somehow, for example, defense enzymes, for example, or to inactivate some defense molecules. Yeah, and here's a nice example, namely the human immune, some cells in the human immune system can produce so-called reactive oxygen species. For example, here this O2 minus is a radical, is a oxygen radical, and this is very reactive and can harm the pathogen. But the pathogen has some enzyme, the SOD, superoxy dismutase, and this can inactivate these reactive oxygen species. And this is often observed in host pathogen interactions and also in plant herbivore interactions that there is a defense molecule, but this is inactivated by an enzyme of the other organism. Yeah, and actually, I think it's easier to explain with plant herbivore interactions. Therefore, I switch now to that example, but it's also applicable to host pathogen interactions. For example, many plants, for example, cabbage and rape and mustard, they produce glucosinolates. These are defense molecules, or caffeine. Actually, what we drink in coffee is actually originally it was a toxin, namely, I mean, higher amounts it is toxic. Is a defense molecule against herbivores, also animals who eat plants, or nicotine, aspirin, cocaine, and many other substances. Then also, of course, fungi produce antibiotics or can also produce anthelmintics, which are against worms. Or bacteria can produce bacteriocins, which kill other bacteria. Also there is many examples um, defense molecules. So, and then there are these counter defense mechanisms, namely some or even many insects produce enzymes degrading, and they are degrading toxins, but it's a bit more complicated. Often, for example, they can degrade toxin precursors. Often the toxins, are, for example, glucosinolates are produced in a precursor form, so that the plant does not toxify, does not poison itself. Yeah. Then other insects produce inhibitors of plant enzymes that activate the precursors. A third group inactivates the final toxins. Yeah, then for the antibiotics, there is also a nice example because some bacteria produce enzymes called beta-lactamases, which can inactivate penicillin. Then they are resistant against antibiotics because they degrade or they inactivate the antibiotics. So, and now there is a phenomenon occurring, which is in a sense even a bit paradoxical, could be called the endless cycle of defense and counter-defense. Namely, if as the attacking organism, like the pathogen or the herbivore, produces the counter defense, because the attacked organism produces the defense. So, and if the attacking organism produces an enzyme which is perfectly efficient, which can efficiently degrade the toxin, then the toxin becomes useless because if it's inactivated anyway, then it need not be produced. But if then the plant stops producing the toxin, then the enzyme becomes useless. But if the insect stops, because production implies costs, no? So then the organism can save costs by not producing it. But then, then if it stops producing the enzyme, then the toxin becomes useful again. Yeah, and you see there is no Q-Nash equilibrium, so it's very much related to the matching pennies game. And and now we have again this Charlie Trivedi and Ravindra Garde, who's also from India. He was in my group, but he's now a postdoc in Braunschweig in Germany. And we have now a paper in press where we describe this by game theory. And so then here it's for host and pathogen, where there is defense or no defense and counter defense or no counter defense. In principle, there is a continuum, because they could also produce maybe 30% of the maximal amount. But let's first consider the two strategy game, and then we wrote some payoffs as parameters, again with benefit and cost. And so in the high benefit case, there is no Q-Nash equilibrium. Then it's exactly this case. Because then there is a cycle, a little bit like in the rock, scissors, paper game. As if, for example, the host has no defense and the pathogen has no counter defense, then the host has an incentive to produce the defense, but then the pathogen has an incentive to produce the counter defense, and so on as a cycle. It is called the generalized matching pennies game because the payoffs can be different. Although we consider relatively simple payoffs, but it's a bit more complicated than in the classical matching pennies game. There's just +1 and -1. So interestingly, in the low benefit case, then the equilibrium is no defense and no counter defense. Then it's a pure measure equilibrium, because costs are so high that there is no really an incentive to produce something. So then we have thought, how can we resolve, so to speak, this endless cycle? And as I told you, in principle, there is a continuum of strategies. So one could probably also describe it in a continuous way, but as far as I know, there are much less approaches with continuous spectrum of strategies. So usually it's discretized. And so then we said, now then let's discretize it in 3 strategies, namely no defense, intermediate or medium defense, and full defense, and the same for counter defense. And so then how to describe the effect of this? And there is actually in literature there is a Sims-Rauscher model where they use microelement kinetics, but here we have make it a bit more complicated by using Hill kinetics. If you have a Hill kinetic, a cooperative or sigmoidal kinetics, because this is often observed in those response curves, because we have to quantify somehow the effect of a toxin. But then there is also the cost. And in the Sims-Rauscher model, they assume that the cost is just linearly dependent, as it's proportional to the amount of enzyme or amount of toxin. So, and therefore, we have to either make arithmetic kinetics or Hill kinetics and then subtract a linear function, and then we get this function which I have shown here. So finally it goes down linearly. So and then we see now it's non-monotonic, because in the middle there can be the highest effect, because then we have a good compromise between effect and cost. So and then if we now write a payoff matrix with 3 strategies, and then the partial defense is then the pure Nash equilibrium. Partial defense, partial counter defense. Whereas if the function were monotonic, then we would get oscillations. But I think the observation, maybe one should look more in detail into the literature or do some experiments also. But I think what we observe is really this compromise, this trade-off between both sides, so that they use partial defense and partial counter defense rather than oscillations. And if there are oscillations, then the question is in which time scale, do they switch it off and on and off in a million of years or within 1 year? But maybe One could think, for example, because there are sometimes in the genome pseudogenes can be observed, which are silenced genes. So maybe in earlier stages of evolution they produced the toxin and then it was silenced. Um, this is still an open question. Yeah, this brings me to the conclusions. So, also the concept of optimality is very helpful in biology. Yeah, I didn't mention it, but for example, there are papers to understand or to explain biochemical pathways on the basis of optimality principles. But there are some paradoxical or apparently meaningless phenomena. For example, in the case of the prisoner's dilemma, because then it would be better for both players to use the cooperative strategy. And if we just described it by optimization, then this solution would come out, but it's not observed. And often they get stuck in this Nash equilibrium, which is not optimal for neither of them. Yeah, and this can be explained by game theory. Yeah, then as I mentioned, the concept of Nash equilibrium is very, very appropriate in cell biology and microbiology. Because there's no psychological moral factors. But actually, there can be communication. Also, microorganisms can communicate by quorum sensing, for example. Yeah, then I think an important point, why don't we just describe it by differential equations? And sometimes it is done, for example, there are the so-called replicator equations, which are used in game theory. But here I just showed payoff matrix, Nash equilibrium, and this is, so to speak, the asymptotic behavior. We look what is the final result, and this requires less kinetic parameters than in a simulation by differential equations. Then we can say that game theoretical approaches take into account systemic properties. So it's in principle, it's even some emergent properties, like in the prisoner's dilemma, which could not be explained by a reductionist approach where we analyze the players in isolation. So therefore, I would say that game theory is also part of systems biology. Yeah, and then I don't have the time to explain this too much, but there is also biotechnological and medical relevance. For example, in the metastasis game, of course, in medicine, the doctors are interested in suppress metastasis because they are very dangerous. And then there are even some paradoxical effects because according to that theory, the metastasis would occur if the benefit is rather low. As if there is not much glucose, then the cells are motivated or have an incentive to go away. And normally one would think we should give the patient enough to eat, but maybe some caloric restriction would be beneficial. Yes, sorry, yeah, it's actually, I could even say it's a triple-edged sword because the patient should have enough food. On the other hand, one might be interested in starving the tumor, so not to give too much nutrients to the tumor. On the other hand, if it's starved too much, then metastasis could occur because they go away. Yeah, and it's not only this calories, but also vitamins. Is it good to give vitamins or not? So it's a very complicated story. Okay, yeah, then that's the end. I want to show the acknowledgements because yeah, it was mentioned that there are some Indian people in my group. So right now there is Shalu Dwivedi and Suman Chakraborty, and who also worked a lot on plant herbivore interactions, but not with game theory, with other approaches. And then there was Ravindra Garde, and then Heiko Stark contributed to the metastasis story. And of course, other team members and cooperation partners. I cannot mention all of them. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Stefan. We have time for questions. So, Stefan, I was wondering, like, you mentioned, like the possible relevance of this game theoretic approach to study metastasis and so on. So, would you say that there are certain kinds of clinical approaches which this would suggest? I mean, this game theoretic type of analysis for
Yes,
cancer?
yeah, there is this application which I just mentioned, but is very complicated, and I think so far there is no real practical suggestion we could make, or other authors, because it's difficult to say should the tumor be starved or not. But there are also, didn't have time to mention the other literature. There is, for example, in the Netherlands, there's a group of Katarina Stankova. She's Czech Republic originally, but now for a long time in the Netherlands. And they also use game theory for cancer treatment. Probably are much more sophisticated than we do, and I think there's even already some concrete suggestions they can make for the doctors.
Mm-hmm. Right. And how easy it is to extend this kind of approach to, let's say, multiple types of mutants. So if you have, let's say, n number of possible mutant strategies. So, like you mentioned just two, go or grow. So now, let's say you have certain other strategies coming up.
Mm.
Let's say, the cells decide that uh, either of these two strategies is not meeting their goals and they decide to come up with a third one. How easy it is to extend this framework to study that in the context of
Yeah, I
cancer?
think it's not so complicated. I want to amplify your image, but I see myself. Yeah, I think it's. I mean, for the Plant Herbivore game, I showed how it can be extended to more strategies, which is in a sense more mutants. There could be, for example, let's say the biotype produces the full amount of toxin, then one mutant produces only half of it, and another mutant doesn't produce at all. It's the null mutant. So these are these three strategies, which I
Mm-hmm. Okay.
showed here. Here, also no defense, partial defense, and
Right.
defense. And we have, so to speak, biotape and two mutants.
Okay.
For the cancer game, for the metastasis game, we didn't do that, but it's a good suggestion. We could think of, maybe only go halfway or go a longer distance. Or then, they could distinguish, maybe distinguish according to the secondary site. For example, they could maybe settle in the liver, or others settle in the brain or in the bone marrow. And so, this is a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
But
Right.
it would, of course, make it even more complicated.
Right. Right.
Already now we have many game types.
Yeah.
But probably, we didn't do that among these many game types. Maybe some of them can be eliminated because they are biologically not relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you then include more mutants, then some other modifications, it's certainly worth thinking about.
Okay. And so you were mostly talking about cancer. So I'm wondering whether you're also working on infectious diseases. So could this kind of approach work for
Also here this, therefore I showed this picture, but I didn't detail it because I think for plant herbivore
All
interaction it's
right.
easier to understand, but in
Yes.
principle the
Yes.
same can be applied to here infectious
Sure.
diseases.
Sure.
For example, is it worth increasing uh, even more for example, production of reactive oxygen species, but maybe not because then it's too costly and they are inactivated anyway. We also worked on these interactions, and I didn't show it today. We even considered so-called counter defense, because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, also not here for the superoxide dismutases, but for example, for the here for the beta-lactamases on the bottom.
Right.
Fungi produce penicillin or cyclosporin. Is also, I think what is important that these are beta-lactam antibiotics, or it's cephalosporin. Anyway, there are the other, in addition to penicillin, which have this beta-lactam ring. So, and then some bacteria produce beta-lactamases, which split also open the ring, the beta-lactam ring, and therefore inactivate. This is then a counter defense. And then actually some streptomyces produce an inhibitor of beta-lactamases, which is then uh, actually a counter defense. Yeah? So there is also attack, defense, counter defense, counter
Right.
defense. And then an interesting question is, how many times does it go back and forth? Yeah? Because probably it's not useful to have too many levels, because then it becomes at some point unreliable. Because if there's a mutation in one level, then all the further levels become useless. And yeah, this makes it, of course, even more complicated, but it's very interesting. But probably difficult to describe by game theory. So we used then, but this is another branch of research, we used optimization, for example, to calculate the optimal allocation, also how much percent of the capacity should be invested into the defense and how much into the counter defense, because it's by the same organism. You know?
Right. Right. Yeah. Get it.
And this has certainly medical applications because actually this is used for a long time already without maybe considering game theory or optimization. Namely, there are some drugs which combine penicillin with this inhibitor. For example, clavulanic acid is such an inhibitor. Yeah, there is a combined drug which gives antibiotics and an inhibitor of the enzyme of the bacterium which degrades penicillin.
Right.
And then, of course, it's interesting to calculate the optimal mixture.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I can see its significance, in studying how this antibiotic resistant strains are gradually taking over, which is, like a major problem in clinical sciences these days. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no resistance of bacteria.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Sashi.
So perhaps you mentioned this in the last slide. So are there examples at the system level also where you can use game theory to make some interventions in a positive way? For example, in gut bacteria human interaction. So that's more like not at a single cell level, but at a system level. So are there such examples in these kind of studies or?
On the system level, yeah, certainly there are some examples, but there is some literature on.
Or do you think that that's an area where these things can be explored?
As there is some literature about interactions between bacteria. Yeah, we focused on fungi, but in principle it's maybe not so. Mathematically, it's not so much different. There is about bacteria and the human host, but for the moment I don't remember. Was Shalu, who is present, do you remember an example where game theory is more applied on the system level? But there is certainly.
Sorry, I don't remember now.
Yeah. But it's certainly worth looking into the literature. There's quite a lot now on the game theory is applied on, so to speak, on the microbiological level. No? Earlier, so in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, it was applied mainly to higher organisms. For example, to wolves fighting against each other, or also in plants. How plants, for example, compete for water. So they have long roots or broader roots also to get the water. And in microbiology, it was only maybe in the recent 10 years, in the last 10 years, but it's an increasing body of literature, so it's now already difficult to know all the literature.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, so if not, let's thank Professor Schuster once more.